What's the Big Idea, Ben Franklin? By Jean Fritz. In 1732, when he was 26 years old, Benjamin Franklin had one of his best ideas. He decided to publish an almanac. Every family bought an almanac each year. People read it to find out the holidays, the weather forecasts, the schedule of tides, the time the sun came up and went down, when the moon would be full, when to plant what. It was just the kind of book that Benjamin loved, full of odd pieces of information and bits of advice on this and that. It was, in addition to being a calendar, a grand how-to book, and Benjamin figured he knew as many how-tos as anyone else. Besides, he knew a lot of jokes. He put them all in his almanac, called it Poor Richard's Almanac, and published the first edition in 1733. His specialty was short one-line sayings. Sometimes these one-liners were quick, how-to hints for everyday living. Eat to live, not live to eat. A penny saved is a penny earned. Half-wits talk much, but say little. Sometimes his one-liners were humorous comments on life. Men and melons are hard to know. Fish and visitors smell in 3 days. In a few years, Franklin was selling 10,000 copies of his almanac every year. He kept it up for 25 years. This was certainly a good idea, but it was not Benjamin Franklin's big idea. He was 40 years old when he first became interested in the idea that would become the big one. By this time, he had 2 children, William Temple, who was 17, and Sarah, who was 2. A third child, Francis, died in 1736 when he was 4 years old. The idea had to do with electricity, which had become a new fad. For some time, it had been known that electricity could be generated by rubbing glass tubes with silk. Now a Dutch scientist had found that this electricity could be stored in specially equipped bottles, then drawn from them by applying wires, or conductors, to the 2 sides of the bottle. All over Europe, people were meeting in darkened rooms to see these sparks and the tricks that could be performed. Wires twisted into the shape of giant spiders were electrified. Sparks were drawn from a cake of ice and even from the head of a boy suspended from the ceiling by a silk rope. Electrical performers traveled from town to town selling shocks to curious people. Once, before a large audience in Spain, 180 grenadiers were linked together by wire, then given a shock to make them jump into the air at the same time. Franklin bought electrical equipment and began writing to European scientists. He learned to perform the usual tricks and made up some of his own. Once he gave an electrical picnic. He planned to kill a turkey by an electrical shock, roast it in a container connected to electrical circuits, on a fire lit by an electrical bottle. He was, however, so carried away by his performance in front of his guests that he was careless. He took the whole shock through his own arms and body and was knocked unconscious. When he came to, he was embarrassed. "What I meant to kill was a turkey," he said. "Instead, I almost killed a goose." His big idea was that electricity and lightning were the same. Up to that time, most people had thought lightning was, and always would be, as mysterious as heaven itself. And here was Franklin saying it was the same stuff that you saw in parlor tricks, only on a grander scale. What was more, Franklin believed he could prove it. "Let a sentry box be built on the top of a high tower," he wrote a scientist in Europe. "Put a pointed rod in the tower and let a man stand in the box during a storm." Franklin knew that electricity was attracted to pointed iron rods. If the man in the sentry box could find that lightning was also attracted to a rod, that would prove they were the same. The only reason Franklin didn't make the experiment himself was that Philadelphia didn't have a high enough tower, or even a high hill. In the spring of 1752, 3 scientists in Europe tried the experiment, and all 3 proved that Franklin's big idea was right. One scientist was killed, but that was because he was careless. Meanwhile, Benjamin thought of a way to prove the idea himself. One stormy day, he raised a kite with a long pointed wire at the tip and felt the electric shock come through a key he had tied to the kite string near his hand. So he already had his own proof when the news reached him about the experiments in Europe. Still, he was surprised to hear how excited people were about his idea. He was suddenly famous. Indeed, he was becoming the most celebrated man in America. The King of France sent him congratulations. The Royal Society of England presented him with a medal. Universities gave him honors and called him Dr. Franklin. Newspapers praised him. Benjamin was pleased. He felt secretly as proud, he said, as a girl wearing a new pair of garters. A big idea, however, meant little to Benjamin Franklin unless he could put it to everyday use. So he invented the lightning rod, a pointed iron rod that could be raised from the roof of a house or barn to attract lightning and lead it harmlessly through a wire and into the ground. For his own lightning rod, he also fixed up a contraption that would ring a bell in the house whenever lightning hit. Debbie hated that bell. Benjamin would have liked to do nothing but experiment with his ideas, but people had discovered that he was more than an inventor. Whatever needed doing, he seemed able and willing to do it. He was made Postmaster General and organized a new system so that it took only 3 weeks instead of 6 weeks for a letter to go from Boston to Philadelphia. Later, he cut the time to 6 days. He helped organize a fire insurance company, a hospital, and an expedition to seek the Northwest Passage. And because he was so good at talking people into doing what he wanted them to do, in 1757 he was sent to London. He was to do what he could to further the interests of the people of Pennsylvania. In London, Benjamin began right away to live in style and comfort. He bought new shoes, new wigs, new shirts, a new watch, 2 pairs of silver shoe and knee buckles, new candlesticks, new chinaware, and a new carriage. He had his sword blade repaired and ordered new spectacles because he'd left his best pair at home. He rented 4 large rooms in a house owned by a Mrs. Stevenson, who treated him like a king. When his back itched, she gave him an ivory back scratcher. She warmed his shirts before he put them on. She even trained her cat not to sit in his favorite chair. Of course, she served only the foods he liked best, never beef, which upset him. And as if this were not enough, Benjamin received a regular supply of American cornmeal, venison, cranberries, and bacon from his wife, Debbie. He sent Debbie presents in return, including a crimson satin coat and an apple core. With the exception of 2 years back in America, Benjamin lived in London for 18 years, from the time he was 51 until he was 69. Debbie, afraid to cross the ocean, died the year before he finally returned. Benjamin was in London when George III was crowned King of England. He was there in 1765 when England began laying down taxes and making trouble for America. He did his best to keep the 2 countries friendly, but over the years England became more and more stubborn. First one tax, then another. Sometimes England would repeal a tax, but it would never give up its right to tax America. Benjamin discovered that all his rules for arguing, which had worked so well in the past, were of no use against such stubbornness. He finally gave up arguing altogether one day in 1774, when he was called before the British government to explain his activities in behalf of America. For 2 hours he stood before the government's Privy Council. He was shouted at, laughed at, insulted, and condemned. Franklin, white with rage, said not one word. He was being treated like an apprentice. Indeed, England was treating America as if it were a country of apprentices instead of a country of free men. And Franklin could stand it no longer. In the spring of 1775, he returned to America, only to find that America and England were already at war. The Battle of Lexington had been fought while he was at sea. Franklin was so mad that he told Americans if there wasn't enough gunpowder to go around, they should use bows and arrows against the English. He was so mad that he would have swum out into the ocean with electric bolts to shoot at the English, if he could have. But America had other uses for him. Right away, he was put in the Continental Congress and placed on 10 different committees. When the time came to write the Declaration of Independence, he was one of those asked to do it. As it turned out, Thomas Jefferson did the writing, but Franklin made changes. The truths that Jefferson held to be sacred and undeniable became self-evident truths when Franklin had finished. But these jobs were small compared to the big one Congress had for him. Benjamin Franklin was still America's best arguer and America's most famous citizen. So, in the fall of 1776, he was sent to France to try to talk the French into entering the war on America's side. George Washington would run the war in America, but Benjamin Franklin would run it in Europe, getting all the help and money from any country he could. Benjamin was 70 years old now and found the ocean trip hard. The seas were rough. The weather was freezing. He had boils on his body, gout in his legs, and a skin disease on his head that bothered him so much that he wore a loose fur hat instead of his usual wig. When he arrived in France, he was rumpled, crumpled, and weak. Not the stylish, famous-looking figure the French had expected. Of course, Benjamin planned to dress up as soon as he felt better. But to his surprise, he discovered the French liked him as he was, fur hat and all. Indeed, he was an immediate sensation. A plain man in the most fashionable country in the world. Within a month, the French had made him their hero. French ladies found him charming. They fussed over him and called him Papa. They hung his picture over their mantels and wore his picture in their rings. Frenchmen cleared the way for him when he appeared in the streets. So Benjamin never did dress up. He never wore a wig or carried a sword the whole time he was in France, not even when he went to see the king. If being plain made him popular, Benjamin Franklin had the good sense to stay plain. Paris suited old Benjamin perfectly. On one side he had the River Seine when he wanted a swim. On the other side he had friends when he wanted company. Altogether, Benjamin had such a good time in Paris that he couldn't always be bothered with his old rules for good behavior. Frequently, he ate too much. But rather than worry, he carried a bottle of oil of wormwood for indigestion, and he gained weight. Sometimes he called himself Dr. Fatsides. Occasionally, he went to extremes. If he became interested in a game of chess, he'd stay up all night playing. And he wasn't neat. His desk was a mess. A Scottish visitor once pointed out the danger of leaving important state papers scattered so carelessly over his desk. There might be spies in the household, the Scotsman said. And there really were spies. But the important thing was that Benjamin did what he'd set out to do. He talked France into joining America in the war, and he took good care of America's business in Europe. And when peace came in 1783, he helped to write the peace treaty. When Franklin, 79 years old now, finally returned to Philadelphia, he was given a wildly enthusiastic welcome. Cannon were fired, bells rung, parades formed, speeches made. His daughter, Sarah, was so excited that she fell into a wheelbarrow. But the people of Pennsylvania put Franklin right back to work. 3 years in a row, they elected him president of their government. And when Franklin was 82, they asked him to help write the Constitution of the United States. For 4 months, he attended meetings of the Constitutional Convention. Sometimes he dozed off during a speech. Often he disagreed with what was being done. But in the end, he was satisfied with the Constitution. With so many different opinions, he said this was the best they could do. Now at last Benjamin Franklin was finished with public life. He did not have long to live, But even when he couldn't get out of bed, he still read and he still wrote. And every afternoon his 9-year-old granddaughter, Deborah, would come to his bedside, and he would hear her spelling lesson for the next day. If she did well, he would give her a spoonful of fruit jelly that he kept beside him. At 11 o'clock on the night of April 17th, 1790, Benjamin Franklin died. He was 84 years old, a man who had not only had a big idea of his own, but had played a large part in one of the biggest ideas of his time, the idea of an independent United States.